Hello and welcome to episode 461 of the Money to the Masses podcast with your resident expert as always, Damien Fay, and me, Andy Leaks. Damien, welcome back. How are you doing?
Yeah, it's good to be back as ever. So a bit of housekeeping before we crack on with the show. There won't be a podcast episode next week. It's half term. Andy and I will not be around as much. Well, actually, it's me rather than Andy. Andy's still going to be around. So we won't have an episode next week, but don't worry, we'll be back the following week. Other things to just point out, do follow us on social media for those of you who are not already following us, because I'm doing more in terms of video. So going forward over the next year, I'm going to be doing a lot more in terms of videos explaining stuff to do with money on things like Instagram. But I'm also going back to play with TikTok. So if you don't follow us on TikTok, then do go on there and find us and then start to follow us. You'll see videos that I am doing for all sorts of things about money, and there's some real basics, back to basic stuff on there that's really easy to consume. So make sure you follow us on that. And also, while we're doing the admin, please do support the podcast. It's crucial that you do. Go to moneytothemasses.com/podcast, and you'll find a range of offers on there. You'll find links to how you can subscribe to our newsletter, for example, and there are exclusive offers on there as well. And actually, we've just added a new offer on there for Sky Stream, so do check that out. So please go to the page and support the show.
Okay, so that's the admin out of the way. Let's talk about what we've got coming up on this week's show.
So we've got three pieces, and I'm going to enjoy this. It does feel like I'm kind of taking a slight back seat. So I've just started the show saying I'm not going to be here next week, and Andy's going to headline two of the pieces this week. So one of the pieces that I'm going to be doing is in relation to the stock market and the UK general election. So this week there was the shock announcement. I mean, for some people they might claim it wasn't a shock, that we are going to be having a UK general election on the 4th of July. Now, as we make this podcast, that's exactly 6 weeks from today. So what I want to do is go over some research that I've done for 80/20 investor members, just give you some of the highlights about the impact on the stock market historically when we've had a general election. And interestingly, there are some numbers in relation to how the market has performed in the 6 weeks leading up to the general election, so it's particularly relevant. We're also going to be doing a piece on festivals, aren't we, Andy?
Yeah, so we're going to be, it's festival season coming up. We've got lots coming up: Glastonbury, Latitude, the Isle of Wight Festival, and these tickets are costing an absolute fortune. Obviously, we have issues with weather and travel, so I'm going to look through what people's rights are in terms of refunds, not just for the tickets themselves in case of cancellations or rescheduling, but also accommodation, travel. So we'll go through all those details. It'll be an interesting piece.
And the final piece is in relation to energy.
Yeah, so Ofgem have announced the new figures which will come into place from the 1st of July. So we're going to be talking around those figures, what they actually mean in terms of your annual bills, and whether now is the time to really start thinking about fixing your energy tariffs.
And as Andy mentioned there, we want to give you some historical context, because I know it's quite confusing when we talk about the energy price cap, and of course we had the energy price guarantee from the government, and trying to give you an idea of where energy bills are heading, and in particular how they stack up in relation to recent history. So you can yourself, when you're listening to the podcast, judge where your bill is going to be in terms of how much you might end up paying per month on average.
Yeah, so I mean, we're going to start with that piece right now. So let's look at the numbers then. The announcement was made, and so from the 1st of July, essentially the average annual household bill is going to be around about 7% cheaper over the year. So it's going to be a saving there. So we wanted to look back at those numbers. What does it actually mean? Remember, the April to June figures that we're currently in now, they were already a 12% reduction from January. So I'm going to just bring it up on screen here. For people watching the video, we'll pop the details up on screen as well so they can see it. But Damien, I'm showing you the screen there. The numbers, how they fluctuate, if we go right back to sort of 2019, just to give some historical context, like you say, the energy price cap was set at just over £1,000. But we've got to remember that this was a time when none of us were really paying the energy price cap, were we?
No, so we were in you could say it was a functioning energy market, or it was one that was in a state of collapse that it didn't yet know that it was going to be, because obviously we had lots of different energy providers, lots of small ones that have since gone to the wall, but there was a lot of competition, and so the prices that we were paying were obviously below the energy price cap. So no one was really paying the energy price cap prices. So people were typically fixing energy bills. So the energy price cap wasn't part of the common discussion around energy. But of course, things started to change as we moved into 2022. So the numbers in 2022 or late 2021, they were roughly around.
So in late 2021, so October 2021, the energy price cap was set at £1,200. So roughly £100 per month was the average energy bill for families and households. But again, people were probably largely paying less than that because they were on various different deals with the smaller providers, as you mentioned. But then it jumped up to around about £1,800 in April of 2022. Now, you've got to remember that day. April 2022 was quite key. It was just after the Ukraine-Russia war, and where we started to see those energy prices rocket.
Yeah, and then if we jump forward through recent history, we actually got to the point where, looking at the numbers here, that we had an energy price cap in April 2023 that was over £3,000. But you've got to remember that throughout the whole period, we also had the energy price guarantee from the government that was capping our energy prices at set levels, which was roughly around £2,500. So we weren't paying the energy price cap. Now, the reason we mention all of that is because to give people context where we are now, and I'm going to just use a rough figure because it's easier to understand. If we're looking at around £1,500 for July this year, you can then see that how that stacks up into recent history. This really is heading back to the levels that we were paying at the back end, or really the early part of, or back end of 2021, but the early part of 2022, before the energy crisis. So we've gone through a whole wave of rises, and we're starting to get back to levels that were before the energy crisis started. So that gives you some idea of the history, where we have been and where we are now. Obviously, they've made predictions about where the energy price cap is likely to go in the future, haven't they, as well?
Yes, so to remind people, the energy price cap from Ofgem changed from a 6-monthly announcement to a 3-monthly announcement, and that was so that they could make changes more frequently, and so that people weren't having to pay too much for too long. Looking at the projections from Cornwall Insight, which, if you remember, they're kind of like a specialist in that area, and they make predictions on where that energy price cap is going to be. They reckon that come October, it will sneak up slightly to around about £1,600 per month, and then going through to sort of December, January, it will sneak up again ever so slightly. So if you take all of those 12 months, so the current situation that we know we're in, plus the projections, overall, if you even it all out and average it, it's still around about £1,600 per month.
Yeah, and I know this is a prediction and it's Cornwall Insight, but they are spookily accurate in their predictions. So we bring it to you because they are worth listening to. They very seldom are far out when it comes to the predictions of certainly the very next energy price cap announcement. Of course, obviously, things can change in terms of politics, and I'm talking about particularly geopolitics here. If there's a war or something happens, then energy prices can rocket like they did previously. But to give some context to that, so you might be sitting there hearing those numbers and thinking, right, I'm not really sure my energy bill is going to be significantly less or more than they were. To give you an idea, if you look at where the energy price cap is predicted to be in July and compare it to where it was in the winter that we've just been through, then your bills are likely to be around about 20% cheaper than they were during the winter. So that's where we're heading to. So if you were paying £200 a month on average, which is taking into account energy usage and the price cap throughout the past year, then you're looking at the cost of the energy to be about £160 a month. That's what I'm just trying to give you an idea of, if things stayed like that, where your energy direct debit would be in the future when you get to the same period next year, so in the winter. So that gives you an idea. We're moving in the right direction. It's also the reason, if you've been listening to the news this week, where we'd seen inflation start to come down and we're getting nearer the official 2% target rate, the drop in energy is helping in that regard. And particularly, obviously, in the UK, where we have the energy price cap, that's making a big difference to UK consumers.
Yeah, so it kind of bodes that question then, is now the right time to fix now that we know that the energy prices are coming down? What we would say is have a look, because there are more and more deals coming to market now, these fixed price energy deals. Generally, the 12-month fixed price energy deals, you can get deals now that are around about anywhere between 3 and 8 or 9% cheaper than the current energy price cap. So you can make an immediate saving there. You've got to bear in mind we don't know what the future energy price caps are, so you'll be locking in at a slight saving based on the current energy price cap figures. But that may be something you might want to consider, because you may be someone who just wants to know what they're going to be paying. And that gives you the assurance that you're not going to be paying more than you're currently locking it in at. And that might be worth it to some people. One deal that I wanted to highlight, which I think is probably a middle ground, is not a fixed deal. It is a tracker deal. That's essentially what it is. E.ON's Next Pledge. We have talked about it before on the podcast, but it's a tariff that might be worth considering because it guarantees to track whatever the energy price cap is going forward, but 3% cheaper. So that way you are going to be paying less than the energy price cap guaranteed. The only flip side to that compared to a fixed deal is if something happens geopolitically and energy prices surge, if there's another war, for example, and energy prices start to really rocket up, you will be tracking those energy prices upwards, whereas a fixed deal, you're guaranteed to pay what you fix at.
Yeah, and I think the takeaway as well is that where people are looking about when things were at their worst, then you're probably hoping, it seems, that the energy bills will be probably about 35% less than where we were when we had the energy price guarantee as well from the government. So things are definitely moving in the right direction. And the point as well is to make sure you read and sign up to our newsletter, because you'll get the content around the new energy tariffs that come out. We review them, and we do review them in detail. But also you'll find out about the new deals, because I think looking at what's going on in the market, I think we're going to see more and more fixed deals come out, so people will be having that conversation about fixing energy and whether it's worth it more in the coming months. It's been a conversation that has been absent in the last, obviously, couple of years, but I think it's going to start returning, particularly then as we head into the autumn. So moving on to the investment piece. Now, this week we obviously had Rishi Sunak stand outside number 10, get soaking wet, and having to speak over somebody playing music very loudly to announce that we were going to be voting in 6 weeks' time in a UK general election. And inevitably, that did catch some people most people by surprise, but there were rumours previously that a July election was possibly on the cards anyway. But it does then lead to me dusting down research that I've done in the past and updating it about what does the UK election really mean for your money when it comes to investing. Now, we'd all like to think that the UK is hugely important in the world stage, but unfortunately I don't think the UK election actually moves markets, certainly doesn't move markets abroad like the US election does. So for the UK election, we really need to focus on what happens to the UK stock market when we have a general election. Now, I've updated some research for 80/20 investor members. If you want to read the whole thing and see the numbers in detail, then you can, of course, take out a free trial. But I'm going to give you just a brief overview of what might happen in the lead up to this election and a bit of insight to what we might get slightly afterwards. Now, when you have a general election, the 6 weeks beforehand, there is a general pattern that it tends to be broadly good news for the FTSE 100. So if you look at the 6 weeks going back to 1987, so we've had a number of general elections since then. In fact, we've had 9 since then. Then typically you would say that the FTSE 100, if you look at the ups and downs in the 6 weeks leading up to it, that it normally rises by about 0.5%. And that is obviously positive news. And the FTSE 100, if you've been paying attention or you invest in UK stocks, you have noticed that we've been hitting all-time highs. It was the laggard when we came into last year when you compare it to global stock markets. It's finally set new all-time highs in recent weeks. So in one way, the UK general election announcement should be positive news for investors. But the problem is when you talk about averages, it does actually mask the range that you get. So there is a wide range of outcomes in the 9 different elections that we've had since 1987. So there have been some very strong rallies of almost 10%, but we've also had some disastrous ones of almost equal size in the opposite direction. And now, just to give you a hint, if we get a scenario, which we do have now actually, where there seems to be a consensus of an outcome that's going to be a significant majority, so of course in this instance it's for Labour to be the new government, then generally what happens, it tends to be positive, because what markets do like is they like certainty. So the issue that you tend to have when you lead up to election day is if there is something that is uncertain, so there's an element of uncertainty, markets predicting maybe hung parliaments or something else. If they're predicting something like a landslide, then that tends to be more positive, and you actually see a rally in markets on average. And again, we're talking about relatively small sample sizes here, but it's generally more positive, and we're looking at something more like 3%. So it will be interesting to see what happens in the next 6 weeks, whether we get a rally into the election day. And of course, what we're going to have to bear in mind, there's quite a bit that will happen between now and then. So you're going to have different parties start to obviously announce their manifestos and what they plan to do, and that will have a big impact. Now, the FTSE 100 has been setting new all-time highs, and if you've listened to past podcasts that I've done about all-time highs, despite the fact that you feel like once you get to a new all-time high, it feels like you're at the top of a roller coaster and you're about to plummet off the other side and steeply fall. Well, the reality is you're more likely to actually see another all-time high after a recent all-time high. Of course, that does eventually come to an end, but you typically start to, once you get new all-time highs, you start to see statistically more of them until obviously a point where the market then will turn lower if there's a catalyst. So for the UK, typically if we get something or an outcome that seems almost guaranteed, then that can be good news. So I'm not going to go into all the other details about what it means for UK stock markets. I will just briefly mention the FTSE 250 because that is a more domestically focused stock market, because there are lots of more, like smaller companies in there. The FTSE 100 obviously has a lot of companies that earn their money overseas. So the FTSE 250, because it's the 250 or 250 largest companies on the stock market in the UK, that tends to have a bit more of a be more impacted by what's going on with the UK economy. And if you look at what the impact of that is across an election, so if we're talking about a month before and a month afterwards, then that tends to be positive. On average, it tends to be about 2% of increase. And again, I'm not going to go into the details on this, so if you want to see the research, you can sign up to 80/20 Investor. But again, it depends if the outcome is expected or not. So to sum it up, if you are expecting a particular outcome, it seems almost nailed on. That tends to be positive for UK equities and particularly the FTSE 100. If you get an outcome that is as you had expected, then that is also particularly positive, but particularly positive for the FTSE 250 as well, because you tend to see that means certainty, markets like certainty, and that means that you hopefully will get something positive happening to businesses. So if you are an investor, you are hoping that the polls end up being right, that the outcome is what the polls suggest, and therefore, setting your political allegiances aside, then that could have a good impact or positive impact on your UK portion of your investments. Now, of course, the pre and post UK election movements are, in their own way, slightly fleeting, because what we tend to see, and again, I'm not going to get into the numbers, but the general theme is that if you go beyond that sort of month after the election, you start going on a bit further, the macro events in the world start to take over, and they start to actually influence the direction of stock markets. So around the election, yes, you can get movements, but they are almost a distraction from what's really going on in the wider world. So a brilliant example was the last election. So leading up to that, it was a statement that I put out in some research that tends to happen. And of course, if you remember, the last election we had was in December 2019. And for all of us, we know what happened in 2020. So a couple of months later, the stock market completely imploded because obviously COVID reared its head. So you had these wider things in the economic or in the sort of in the world anyway, in the main news that start to influence markets. So it's going to be interesting in the next 6 weeks. It could be interesting just after, but it will be business as usual in terms of the macro events taking over what goes on with the UK stock market. One thing to bear in mind as well, we are likely to see a lot of volatility in the next couple of weeks, particularly in currency markets. So I'm thinking more particularly about the or sterling, the pound against, say, the US dollar, because you have to realise as well that once we start seeing the pledges or the manifestos from different parties, then the markets will start to think or look at, well, how they're going to fund this shopping list of promises that they're making. So how is that going to be funded? And that will therefore start to influence things like currency markets and also bond markets. And you only have to go back and remember the disaster that was Liz Truss's government and her budget, when there were tax cuts and people were worried about how things were going to be funded. Then that was the thing that really upset markets and started to cause things to spiral out of control. So we are likely to have a period of volatility. We saw it, well, we've seen it in other stock markets. If you look at India, for example, Indian stock market was flying high, and then when we got to the lead up to the election in India, as soon as there were concerns about what the outcome might be, because it wasn't as expected, we saw a lot more volatility, and actually Indian equities weren't doing particularly well. And they had been one of the biggest leaders in recent months, and actually a strong point in my own 50k portfolio, but then turned on their head and started to become a bit of a drag. So it's going to be a particularly interesting period for the news, but also for investors in the next 6 weeks.
Okay, so let's move on to the final piece of the podcast then. Slightly different topic for us this week. We're going to be looking at your refund rights if your event is cancelled. And I'm thinking about concerts and summer festivals. It's the summer festival season coming up. Glastonbury.
Was this inspired, Andy, by your story that your idyllic country village that you live in was about to be completely swamped by people attending a local music festival?
We do have a local music festival in our local area in Kent, and it's lovely to have an influx of all sorts of
traffic.
Traffic, basically.
But at least you can tell these people now that what their rights are if things are cancelled. So you could be out there banging the drum for the Money to the Masses podcast.
So let's start off with what people's rights are in terms of refunds if their event ticket is cancelled. So you are entitled to a full refund of the face value cost of your ticket if your event is cancelled. So it's pretty much black and white. Now, this doesn't often include booking or administration fees. So if you're using a site, I'll give an example, maybe Ticketmaster, you know they have the additional fees, often it's admin fees and booking fees. Those are separate to the actual event ticket. So the face value of the ticket you'll get a full refund on. You might not be getting a refund on those administration or booking fees. How you receive your refund will depend on how you made your booking in the first place and the method of payment you used. Most refunds for cancelled events will be automatically issued and paid back via the original method that you used, whether that be a credit or debit card. However, remember, a lot of these events you book almost a year in advance for some of them. So if you've changed banks or if your card has expired, just remember that you might need to get in contact with that provider, because they may try and charge it back but be unsuccessful. So the refund may be waiting there, but you'll just need to maybe contact them to get that. Now, the Society of Ticket Agents and Retailers, they are, the acronym is STAR. They're the entertainment industry self-regulated body.
Sorry, I only laugh because it's like the Society of Ticket Agents, and they probably had the STAR bit, and they decided,
How can
and retailers. And I wonder if there are actually any like retailers in that group, or it's just a bunch of ticket agents.
Yeah, and the acronym STAR is perfect for the entertainment industry, isn't it? So you do wonder how they come up with that. But they are the entertainment industry's self-regulatory body, and they dictate that ticket sellers must refund the face value of the ticket when the event is cancelled. So there is a little bit of sort of clout behind that that ensures that you're covered. If you purchase discounted tickets, then you'll only receive a refund equal to the discounted price. So we talked about face value earlier, but of course, if there's a subsequent discount, don't expect to be getting a refund up to the face value of the ticket if you've only purchased it at a discount. So those refunds are fairly straightforward, where you've purchased it directly from the venue or from the official ticket seller. it is slightly more complex if you've bought your ticket through a third-party website or a reseller, if you like, because you've got to think that the ticket has come to you third hand. So effectively, your refund could end up in the hands of the person who sold you the ticket. So you're just going to have to be careful how you've purchased that ticket, check the terms and conditions, and be mindful that if you're buying through a third-party seller, that there are risks involved with that. So if you don't want to be left without a refund, then go via the official ticket sellers and the merchants, etc. There are plenty of reputable third-party websites, but the rules are slightly different. So just be careful on that.
Okay, so that's if the event's cancelled. If it's rescheduled, is it the same thing?
Yeah, actually, that is probably more likely than a full cancellation, because obviously things often happen in the entertainment industry. We had issues with concrete recently, with various venues having to close down. Those events weren't cancelled; they were rescheduled to different dates, and obviously there are going to be people who have.
That happened to an event I went to recently. It was actually ended up being in a marquee rather than the theatre itself. But that's sort of an aside. It still occurred.
Yeah.
But then you ended up, interestingly, when I got to the event, the prime seats that were like in the stalls actually ended up being the worst seats in the whole house, because they were all on the same level, because they built a marquee and put those people near the stage, but they were all on the same level, not tiered ever so slightly, so you were slightly elevated from the people in front of you. And there were loads of people who were complaining they couldn't see, but they didn't know that until they got there. So that's a sort of a side thing, but it's just a point that there are whole events that get completely moved to a temporary structure.
Yeah, so we'll cover in just a second refunds in terms of travel and accommodation, but looking at the actual ticket itself, if the event has been rescheduled, you're entitled to a full refund, and that is because effectively the terms have changed. The terms of your purchase have changed. So even if you can make the rescheduled date, if you don't want to go on that day, ultimately they've moved the goalposts, so you are entitled to a full refund. So effectively what I just said in the last section, the same is still true. Get your refund in the usual way. You should receive details from the ticket provider, usually by email, explaining the full process. Again, it is slightly trickier if you bought it through a third party. Listen back to my last section, the same rules apply. I want to cover just briefly about refunds if you've changed your mind, because these things do happen. You buy things on a bit of a whim, you get excited, you think, there's only a few tickets left, you press buy, and then 6 months later you're left with these tickets. This person is no longer top of the charts, I'm thinking.
The reason I'm laughing is because I feel like you guys know Andy well enough now. Andy is an impulse purchaser. I feel like this section of the podcast is just for Andy, who ends up buying things, events, and for some reason hasn't checked that he is actually able to attend.
I have bought many a thing that I am not. Actually, we did something recently where I revealed that is exactly what happened. But whether you can get a refund for simply changing your mind, or the fact that you can no longer attend because you've double booked yourself, ultimately, no. You're not entitled to a refund if you just changed your mind or if you can't make it. But you might be able to get some money back. You may be able to sell the ticket. We talked about third-party resellers. There are lots of reputable places that allow you to do it. Obviously, family members, buy and sell sites. You can try and offload those tickets. Be aware that some tickets do not allow third-party selling. Some particularly top-profile pop type concerts, they're very specific about how those tickets are sold on. And so just be careful before trying to do that. And be careful, again, if you're trying to buy third-party tickets that the ticket sellers allow, because you could end up ultimately buying something that can't be used. So just be careful on that. So if all of that fails and you haven't managed to get a refund, now that might be because the ticket seller is unable to provide a refund because they may have gone bust, or just unwilling. Let's say you believe that you're due a refund and they're saying you're not, and you believe in your heart of hearts you're right, you should be getting a refund. You could do it another way, and that's to use Section 75 of the Consumer Credit Act. Now, under the Act, your credit card provider is jointly liable with the ticket provider. So long as you've spent more than £100, and that's to do with the terms and conditions of the Section 75 Consumer Credit Act, you could go down that route. So ultimately, if the ticket you've bought has been cancelled and you can't get a refund for it, it hasn't been delivered as promised. So you may be able to claim under Consumer Credit Act and get a refund that way.
It is the amount of the product that you buy has to be valued between £100 and £30,000. The amount you pay on your card doesn't actually have to be that. You could pay £5 towards the tickets, but the price of the thing that you purchase has to be more than that £100 and less than £30,000. And let's be honest, if you're going to an event, the chances your ticket is probably going to be more than the £100 anyway. So that is something to bear in mind. And of course, there's an equivalent but not so good scheme when it comes to paying with debit cards, isn't there?
Yeah, it's called the chargeback scheme. There isn't that £100 stipulation on that. It depends on the card providers. There's lots of different ones, MasterCard, Visa, etc. They all run their own chargeback scheme. So contact your own card provider if you've paid by debit card, and you may have some success there in terms of getting a refund. Just wanted to cover off finally rights on travel and accommodation. Now, not great news really here, because the problem with people buying event tickets and then purchasing their travel and their accommodation, it's seldom done together as a package. So if it's done as a package, then you're likely going to be covered because there'll be atoll protection or there'll be additional protection. Basically, it is sold as a package, and so if one part of that package falls down, you can get a full refund.
It's a bit like a package holiday.
Exactly that. I think you've been on a football package holiday.
I have actually. You say that, Andy. God, look at me get so excited there. It was because I just had me go down memory lane when I went.
You had an event ticket effectively for the match, but you would have had your travel and accommodation.
Yeah, it was with. I know this is going to bore people senseless, but I was one of the people that was there when Gareth Bale scored his famous hat-trick against Inter Milan, and it was done as a whole package. TUI used to sponsor Tottenham, and they had a whole thing where you got the travel, the hotel, and the ticket was all part of one price that you paid as a season ticket holder. So it was like that. You were like herded like sheep around the place on coach and everything. It was really good. So yes, it does exist where you do get packages that are all included in one thing.
Yeah, so if the event you're going to is part of an overall package that includes your travel and accommodation, the likelihood is you will get a refund for the full amount should you decide not to go. Because of course you might still be able to go and enjoy all the bits around it and do something else instead of the event. It's up to you. But looking at travel and accommodation, if they were purchased separately, this is where people could end up losing out. Firstly, check to see the terms and conditions of your booking. So let's think about hotels, for example. There are different types of bookings that you can make. You can make flexi bookings, advanced bookings. Some of the terms and conditions on those booking arrangements allow you to cancel up to 24 hours in advance. Often they come at a slightly higher fee. If you book a hotel well in advance and choose not to have, I think it's called a flexi booking, then you will likely not have that protection in there. So just think about, if you haven't already booked your accommodation travel for an event you are going to, think about what might happen in the event of a cancellation. You might want to pay a little bit extra for that booking, for your hotel booking, to ensure that you get a refund should something go wrong. If your event has been rescheduled, you may be able to ask your hotel or accommodation provider to change the dates. There might be an administration fee for that, but that is definitely something that they should be able to help work with you, so long as they've got the availability to do so. And if your accommodation provider is unwilling or unable to help you, there is something you could do in terms of travel insurance. If you've got a travel insurance policy, let's say you've got an annual policy through your bank, you might have the ability to be able to claim on that. Be aware that there will be an excess fee likely, but it's just a sort of last resort. It's worth checking. In terms of travel, similar to hotels, there are certain different types of tickets that you can book. If it's planes or trains, where you can have these flexi tickets that allow you to sort of cancel up to 24 hours in advance. Check your ticket, check what you've booked. If you're due to book one, maybe consider booking one of those tickets that allows you to cancel it up to 24 hours in advance. Again, it might cost you a little bit more, but it might be worth doing. And just finally, it's worth double checking with your travel provider, because they may be able, whether it's planes or trains, they may be able to reschedule the dates. I had this recently on a train ticket that was non-refundable, but when I spoke to them for an admin fee, they were able to change the dates on the tickets. So it wasn't a lost cause. I didn't lose the full amount. I had to pay a little bit extra to change the dates, but it worked out for me. So yeah, that's just a sort of whistle-stop tour on events and concerts and festivals and travel. have a little think about it before you pay lots of money.
Yeah, and also if you're heading towards Andy's Village this weekend and you're going to be part of that festival, please do keep the noise down. So that is it for this week. We, as ever, please do follow us on all our socials. Instagram, like I say, I'm going to be doing more on TikTok. Please do join our Facebook group, facebook.com/groups/money to the masses. Do make sure you support the podcast. So go to moneytothemesses.com/podcast. There's all sorts of deals on there, and there are ways that you can save and make money by using comparisons on that page. So it could be anything from, it could be insurances such as car, home, even life insurance. There are also products you can get cash back on. So please do make sure that you go check that out and support this show. I think that is it, Andy. I think I've covered everything. Of course I haven't. So, as always, we leave it to the end. Do leave us a review. You could potentially get a Money to the Masses mug. But more importantly, you'll make Andy and my day by doing so. So that is it. All that's left for us to do is say until next time.
Until next time.